Sorry, there we go. Great. Okay, well, thanks everybody for being here. I'm Braden Hancock, one of the co-founders and head of technology at Snorkel. And the technology that underlies our platform that we've built and that we service today began at the Stanford AI Lab about 5-6 years ago. And it was part of an initiative that was focused really on combating, dealing with what we observed then, and it has increasingly become a problem since then, the primary bottleneck in developing and shipping AI applications. And that is, of course, the training data. Anybody who's worked on deploying AI in practice has observed that it's often not deciding how many layers your neural network should have that makes the big difference. It's, do you have the data? Do you have enough of it? Is it clean enough? Can you update it? All these types of issues. And so, the conclusion we arrived at then, and then have since done years of work on and 50+ publications describing different techniques for dealing with, we observed that it's really the manual aspect of that labeling process that makes it such a bottleneck. It's a bottleneck in terms of time, the fact that humans need to spend time on every individual label that you get. It scales extremely poorly. It's a bottleneck in terms of money because the time is money there. You pay for every label, and the millionth label costs about the same as the first label, frankly, because again, it's human eyes on each and every individual one. And then it's a bottleneck in terms of trustworthiness and transparency. And the fact that when you have a pool of labels and that's all you have, you don't have insight into the process that went on in your annotators' heads for creating those labels, that makes it extremely difficult to detect bias, correct bias, and deal with different issues that can arise. And so one of the core technologies, there's a number of things, but one of the big pieces here was identifying that with programmatic labeling, we could make a lot of these problems go away. And just to give a simple toy example and make it intuitive for you, you can imagine if we're training a spam classifier, we can approach this a couple ways. With a traditional manual labeling approach, you could find somebody who is expert enough and cleared to view the data and is willing to be locked in a room for tens or hundreds of hours and label that data for you one by one. And as they do this, they're going to read these individual emails, inspect these data points, and come up with a reason for why they think it should be labeled as spam or not spam. And then they're going to throw away that reason and just provide you with a label, which is extremely inefficient because as they look at these data points, they'll identify trends. They'll say, or they'll be able to to tell you if you ask them, I will label this one spam because look at all these prescription drugs it's clearly trying to sell me, and I'm obviously not interested. That's rarely relevant. Or I see here instructions for wire transfers. How often is that showing up in business emails? And these different heuristics that they can come up with don't need to be perfect. It's called weak supervision, this field. They're allowed to be noisy sources that you can combine. But the power ends up being that each of these sources now is a little higher level of an interface. It's a higher leverage interface for injecting your domain knowledge. So rather than one label at a time in this painfully slow process, you can provide these functions, these repeatable little programs, you can think of them as, that can be applied to arbitrarily large amounts of unlabeled data. And so you take a combination of maybe a couple dozen of these and you apply them to hundreds of thousands or millions of data points. And this now happens, this labeling process happens in a matter of often minutes rather than weeks or months. And we've seen this time and time again with people who convert from a manual labeling process to a programmatic one, that there are potentially huge gains here in terms of just the speed and cost side of things. But obviously we're here talking today about the trustworthy side of things as well. So on the second slide, which I'll get to in a second, I'll go into some of the ramifications of this different interface where you now have these programs as the intermediary for domain knowledge. But just to give a couple highlights real quick on the company before I move on. As I mentioned, this began at Stanford. There's lots of work that we've been able to publish in different peer-reviewed journals showing not just empirically but also theoretically. I think the empirical is the more important part there, but this is grounded research that's not lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps. These little programs that label data for you make large training sets that then train models that can extend even beyond the rules that you've created. So you're not just making rule-based systems here. This is really taking advantage of the best that ML has to offer without keeping that restrictive interface of labeling individually. And then through the years, we've made sure to not just stay in the ivory tower. We've worked with fantastic, very ML-forward organizations, many of whom are past that point where you've done your first proof of concept and confirmed that AI can work, and are now looking for a long-term AI strategy that's going to be scalable. That's the wallet helps push a lot of them onto this path. But then also they become to realize over time that they also need something that's defensible, that's auditable, that's transparent. And so this is appealing for other reasons as well. And a lot of these places, all these places, the logos that you see there are places that have deployed Snorkel either with us during the academic days as collaborators or now as customers. And then lastly, I included basically the Crunchbase Digest on the company. So you founded a few years ago, 100 to 150 people now, and headquartered just next door in Redwood City. But let's go to the next slide. So you've got these programmatic labeling functions, and now what does this give you? And first we can talk about the governability side of things. That word was used earlier by Patrick, and I love that word. I've also seen auditability used as a way to say basically you can inspect not just the final model, but also the labels, and even more importantly, the labeling process now. You've got not just the ability to go and look at each and every individual data point in what is almost always a losing battle, but actually see, these intermediate artifacts, which is effectively source code now. You can inspect not a million labels, but again, on its 20 labeling functions, say, and see this is the process. You can reproduce it too. You can make a change, tweak one of these labeling rules if you discover bias in it, and I'll hit that again later, but you can push the re-execute button and regenerate a million labels, toss out your old ones, and it doesn't hurt you because they weren't created in a manual way. There's a process now which you've invested in, and it doesn't take that much longer to write down your reason than it is to just provide a label. So there's this transparency around having this intermediate artifact, which is very valuable. And if you look now at the explainability side of things as well, as was mentioned earlier, when people are making these labeling decisions, you don't necessarily know what biases may be being injected here. You can try and protect against this. You can hide certain fields, but you don't know if maybe reading that name, they assume a certain gender or assume a certain race and are letting that affect their decision. And if labels are provided with this implicit sort of in the labeler's mind only process, you can't do much about that to correct that or identify that. But if there's this intermediate step where these things are being encoded in functions, which you can inspect and rerun and modify, you now have a clear sort of bill of materials basically for every feature that was or wasn't used in your labeling process, which again is sort of a step change in transparency. When it comes to that bias, then there is the ability now to detect that potentially even before you train your first model, as you inspect the labeling functions that have been created and can say, no, that's not allowed. We can't do that, or that doesn't make sense, or that's going to lead to bias. But sometimes even biases can still slip through. It's an extremely difficult problem, an active research problem, one that we're also invested in long term. But more than just being able to say, well, we can't let them in, and if they're in, we're sunk, or we have to start from scratch. Being able to update your labels and adapt is hugely powerful. And so now, when you do discover bias or your needs change or other things come up, you can go back and toggle off individual labeling sources and identify which one is the source of that bias for you, even if it's something that's very much hidden and not obvious on the surface. You have a way of identifying that and then removing it, pushing that that regenerate training set button and having an updated training set in a matter of, again, minutes, not weeks or months. And then finally, the last cell here in the bottom left or bottom right is just a plug. This is a very fortunate timing because tomorrow we're hosting an event as well, specifically focused on AI, ethical AI and government, since there are a number of different initiatives there as well, and top-down pressure and support for having ethical, transparent processes. And so we'll be sharing a little more in detail than I can in 10 minutes, as well as some other interesting speakers, including the CTO of the FBI, speaking on some of their priorities here and how they think about this problem. So feel free to join there as well, and then I'm, of course, also happy to answer questions here. So thank you.
Really quick question for you.
Sure.
Thank you. Obviously, you guys have been working with customers who are kind of early adopters on scaling AI models and dealing with it.
Yep.
So what have you learned about kind of awareness on issues on data labeling, on bias? How much education do you have to do in early days?
Uh-huh.
Where are they today trying to solve it?
Yeah, great question, and I'll repeat that for everyone in the back. So as we've worked with a lot of, very early adopters, ML-forward companies, have we observed sort of maybe differences in the way that they think about these types of issues compared to perhaps, smaller organizations or ones who are new to this? And I'd say that, yeah, in general, the more that companies have gotten past that initial proof of concept of just, can it work at all, to what's our long-term strategy going to be here, I think it becomes to be more on their mind. Especially you can imagine different companies that have an outsized impact on society or medical outcomes or high stakes, things like that, and not just, a convenient sort of side, minor efficiency improvements for their business. But I'd say in general, the conversation is moving that direction. If you look at the AI conferences, the tier ones, things that we also participate in and attend, there are increasingly sessions and workshops and papers on some of these other aspects, the ecological aspects, the ethical aspects, and often requirements even that people disclose and speak to these types of things. So I think it's not going to happen overnight, but we are seeing increasing awareness of a need for AI being transparent, both from the perspective of that's the responsible thing to do, as well as people realizing that you can't set it and forget it and expect to not be liable at the end of the day when there are negative effects that come out of what you're doing. Sure. Is there time for any more questions? One more, maybe? I don't know. Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Braden. I think Krishna? So I think what you've been hearing from some of the startups is actually bringing to life some of the innovation on dealing with issues on bias, around fairness, around AI risk. And you'll hear something, also very innovative from Krishna here, from Fiddler.